There I was, honey, standing by my kitchen window at 6 in the morning, still in my fuzzy pink bathrobe, watching the garbage truck rumble down Maple Street in Phoenix, Arizona, when I spotted something that made my heart drop straight to the floor. Wrapped Christmas presents, MY Christmas presents, sitting right there on top of the Henderson family's trash pile like they were nothing more than yesterday's newspaper.
Y'all, I had to grip that kitchen counter so hard my knuckles went white because I couldn't believe what my own two eyes were showing me. Let me back up just a little bit, sweetie. My name is Beverly, and at 72 years old, I thought I'd seen everything this world had to offer. I've been living in this same Phoenix neighborhood for 43 years, raised 3 kids in this house, buried my husband Harold 6 years ago, and I always prided myself on being the kind of neighbor who remembered everybody's birthday, brought casseroles when folks were sick, and spent my entire Social Security check every December making sure everyone felt special at Christmas. The Henderson family moved in next door about 8 years ago, young couple with 2 little ones who are now teenagers. Sweet as pie, I thought, always waving over the fence, always asking how I was doing. But honey, what I saw in that trash pile that December morning was about to change everything I thought I knew about kindness and family and Christmas spirit. Those weren't just any wrapped presents sitting there like garbage. Those were the presents I had spent 3 months shopping for, 3 weeks wrapping with my arthritic hands, and my entire December grocery budget buying. The red and gold paper I'd picked out special at Walmart, the little silver bows I'd tied so carefully even though my fingers shake something fierce these days. Every single gift I'd given the Henderson family for Christmas was sitting in their trash, still wrapped, like my love and thoughtfulness meant absolutely nothing at all. I let out the longest breath you ever heard and felt all the air leave my lungs at once. My shoulders just dropped like I was carrying the world on them. For a hot minute there, I couldn't even move, just stood there watching those presents catch the early morning sun, thinking about how excited I'd been when I knocked on their door 3 days ago with my arms full of Christmas cheer. Before I tell you what happened next, and honey, this part is going to absolutely shock you, if you're loving this story, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. You know I get so excited when I see y'all in the comments. Speaking of which, what state are you calling home right now? Drop it down below. And sweetie, tell me, have you ever had neighbors who made you feel like your kindness didn't matter? Because your stories help me know I'm not alone in this crazy world. Now let me tell you what I discovered next, because what they did was about to backfire in the most beautiful way. I threw on my old garden coat and my slip-on shoes faster than you could say Merry Christmas and marched myself right out to that trash pile. Y'all, I was shaking, partly from the cold December air, partly from pure heartbreak, and partly from something that felt an awful lot like righteous anger bubbling up inside me. I started pulling those presents out one by one, and honey, each wrapped box felt like a little piece of my heart that had been thrown away. There was the beautiful cashmere scarf I'd bought for Mrs. Henderson at Dillard's, $47 on sale, which meant I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner for a week to afford it. The video game I'd stood in line for 2 hours to get for their son Tyler because he'd mentioned wanting it when I saw him at the mailbox. The makeup set I'd picked out so carefully for their daughter Emma because I remembered her saying she was interested in cosmetics. And the coffee table book about Arizona sunsets I'd chosen for Mr. Henderson because he was always taking pictures with his phone. My voice broke right in half, y'all. I could feel those tears starting to sting my eyes as I held each present, remembering how much thought I'd put into every single one. The words came out between little sobs as I whispered to myself, "Beverly, what in the world did you do wrong?" But you know what? As I stood there in my bathrobe holding those discarded gifts, something started shifting inside me, from pure heartbreak to something that felt a whole lot stronger. I couldn't help but let out this bitter little laugh when I realized that these people had looked me in the eye, smiled their perfect smiles, thanked me for my thoughtfulness, and then literally threw my love away like garbage. Honey, my voice was dripping with all that irony when I said out loud to nobody but the morning sky, "Well, isn't this just perfect? 43 years in this neighborhood, and this is how people treat kindness these days." But, sweetie, they had absolutely no idea what Mama Beverly was about to do next. You could hear the mischief just dancing in my voice as I gathered up every single present and carried them back to my house. Little did they know I'd been keeping track of every kindness I'd shown this neighborhood for years, and I was about to get a very detailed education in what goes around coming around. I set those presents on my kitchen table and made myself a strong cup of coffee while I thought about my next move. Y'all, I've always been what you might call a record keeper. Harold used to tease me about it, but I have a little notebook where I write down every birthday card I send, every casserole I make for sick neighbors, every favor I do, every gift I give. He'd say, "Beverly, honey, you don't need to keep score of being nice." But you know what? That morning, looking at my discarded Christmas gifts, I was mighty grateful for my little record-keeping habit. I opened up that notebook and started flipping through the pages, and sweetie, what I found made my eyes go wide with pure amazement. In the 8 years since the Hendersons moved in next door, I had given them more kindness than I could have imagined. Birthday gifts for both kids every year, casseroles when Mrs. Henderson had her gallbladder surgery, babysitting when they wanted date nights. I'd watered their plants during their vacation to Colorado. I'd signed for packages when they weren't home. I'd shoveled their sidewalk when Mr. Henderson threw out his back. The numbers started adding up in my head, and honey, my voice caught with pure shock when I realized I had documented over $3,000 worth of gifts, food, and services I'd provided to the Henderson family over 8 years. $3,000 of my Social Security money, $3,000 of my time and energy and love, all given freely to people who thought so little of me they'd throw my Christmas presents in the trash. My voice took on this knowing, satisfied quality as I smiled to myself and said, "Well, Beverly, looks like it's time for some Christmas education." You could hear the satisfaction just bubbling up as I realized that my record-keeping habit was about to become the foundation for the most beautiful lesson in consequences this neighborhood had ever seen. I spent the next hour going through that notebook page by page, making a detailed list of everything I had given the Hendersons. Every birthday present, every casserole dish, every favor, every act of kindness. Then I got dressed in my best red sweater and my good boots and started making some very interesting calls. First call was to my nephew Danny, who works at the Phoenix Police Department. "Danny, honey," I said, my voice sweet as pie, "I need to understand something about property law. If I give someone a gift and they throw it away, does it become abandoned property that anyone can claim?" Y'all should have heard how excited he sounded when he told me that once something hits the curb for trash pickup, it's legally considered abandoned and anyone can take it. "Thanks, sweetie," I told him. "You just solved Grandma's little Christmas mystery." Second call was to my friend Margaret, who used to work at the IRS before she retired. "Maggie," I said, trying to keep the mischief out of my voice, "if someone receives gifts worth more than a certain amount, don't they need to report that for tax purposes?" Honey, you could hear her practically cackling through the phone when she told me that gifts over $14,000 between non-family members definitely raised some interesting tax questions, especially if there were questions about whether proper gift tax returns had been filed. Third call was to my church friend Susan, who happens to be a retired small claims court clerk. Susan, darling, I said, what's the process for recovering unreturned borrowed property? The excitement just tumbled out of her voice as she explained how clear documentation could make all the difference in property disputes, especially when there were written records of loans that were never officially gifted. Y'all, a little smile crept into my voice as I hung up that last phone call. You could hear the mischief dancing in my tone as I realized that my decades of detailed record keeping and my morning trash discovery had just handed me the most perfect Christmas present I could have imagined, the chance to teach some very important lessons about respect and consequences. I spent the rest of that day making more phone calls and doing some very interesting research. Called the HOA president about neighborhood etiquette policies. Called the local news station about their human interest stories on Christmas kindness. Called my lawyer friend Patricia about consumer protection issues related to gift fraud. With each phone call, my voice got more animated and more satisfied because I was building something beautiful, a comprehensive education program for people who thought kindness was disposable. But the most important call I made was to my sister Ruth in Tucson. Ruth, honey, I said, my voice practically singing with excitement, remember how you always said I was too generous for my own good? Well, Christmas came early this year, and I'm about to get everything back that I ever gave to ungrateful people. Y'all should have heard her whooping with joy when I told her my plan. Beverly, this is going to be better than any Hallmark movie. That evening, I sat down and wrote the most detailed letter I had ever composed in my 72 years. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. And sweetie, every word was chosen with the precision of a surgeon and the satisfaction of someone who finally had the perfect Christmas present to give, the gift of consequences. The letter started simple and sweet. Dear Henderson family, I hope you're enjoying this beautiful December weather we've been having here in Phoenix. I wanted to follow up on the Christmas gifts I delivered to your family 3 days ago. But honey, what came next is where things got interesting. I documented every single gift I'd given them over 8 years with dates, receipts where I still had them, and estimated values based on current retail prices. I explained how I discovered their Christmas gifts in the trash, which made them abandoned property that I rightfully reclaimed. I mentioned my conversations with Danny about property law, with Margaret about gift tax implications, and with Susan about unreturned borrowed property. My voice was pure excitement, honey, as I wrote the final paragraph. Given that you clearly do not value the gifts and kindness I provided, I will be spending the next 30 days reclaiming all items that were given as loans rather than permanent gifts, as well as requesting reimbursement for services provided and goods consumed. Please consider this your official 30-day notice that our neighborly arrangement is being terminated, effective immediately. I trust you'll understand that just as you have the right to dispose of unwanted gifts, I have the right to reclaim unreturned borrowed property and seek compensation for services rendered. I sealed that letter in my best stationery envelope and walked it over to their mailbox the next morning, right about the same time I discovered their trash pile surprise. Y'all, I couldn't stop smiling as I slid that envelope into their mailbox because I knew Christmas morning was about to get a whole lot more educational for the Henderson family. But sweetie, I wasn't done. Oh no, not by a long shot. While I was waiting for them to read their letter, I started phase 2 of what I was now calling Operation Christmas Education. You see, honey, I'd realized that the Hendersons weren't the only ones in this neighborhood who might need a little reminder about the value of kindness. I spent the next day walking around the neighborhood with my little notebook, making some very interesting observations. Mrs. Watson, 3 houses down, I've been bringing her fresh tomatoes from my garden every summer for 6 years and shoveling her walk every winter. Mr. Rodriguez across the street, I've been accepting packages for their family when they weren't home for 4 years running. The Johnson family around the corner, I'd been babysitting their dog every time they went out of town for 3 years. My voice took on this wondering quality as I walked around taking inventory because, honey, I was starting to realize that I hadn't just been overly generous with the Hendersons. I'd been practically running a one-woman charity operation for this entire neighborhood. And apparently, nobody thought to mention how much they appreciated it. The silence stretched between my expectations and reality like a canyon, and I was finally ready to bridge that gap with some honest communication. That afternoon, I sat down and wrote similar letters to 12 other households in my immediate area. Not demanding or angry letters, mind you, just honest communications about neighborhood relationships and mutual respect. Each letter was personalized with the specific kindnesses I'd shown each family, the dates and estimated values, and a gentle inquiry about whether they preferred to transition our relationship to a more formal service arrangement or to discontinue the current informal agreement. Y'all could hear the joy bubbling up in my voice as I sealed each envelope because I wasn't being mean or vindictive. I was simply treating everyone exactly the way they'd shown me they wanted to be treated, like a service provider instead of a friend. If that's what they preferred, then, honey, that's exactly what they were going to get. The first response came 2 days later, and, sweetie, it was not at all what I was expecting. Mrs. Watson showed up at my door at 8 in the morning with tears in her eyes and a plate of homemade cookies in her hands. "Beverly," she said, her voice all wobbly with emotion, "I had no idea you felt unappreciated. I've been telling everyone in my book club for years about my wonderful neighbor who brings me tomatoes and helps me with my sidewalk. I just assumed you knew how much I was grateful." Honey, my heart just about melted right there on my front porch. You know what? I stopped talking for a hot minute because I realized that maybe I'd been keeping score of the wrong things. Maybe some people show appreciation differently than others. Maybe I'd been so focused on the Hendersons' disrespect that I'd forgotten to notice the quiet gratitude all around me. But then Mrs. Watson asked me something that made my eyes go wide with surprise. "Beverly, what in the world happened with the Hendersons? Emma came over yesterday crying, saying something about Christmas presents and lawyers and tax problems. What did they do to you, honey?" Y'all, my voice dropped to barely above a whisper as I told Mrs. Watson about finding my Christmas gifts in their trash pile. I could barely get the words out because saying it out loud made it feel even more hurtful than it had been that first morning. The words came out softer than a church mouse when I described how I'd spent months choosing each gift carefully, how I'd wrapped them with my shaky hands, how I'd knocked on their doors so excited to share Christmas joy. Mrs. Watson's face went through about 6 different expressions in 10 seconds, ending with pure indignation on my behalf. "Those ungrateful little," she caught herself and took a deep breath. "Beverly, honey, the entire neighborhood needs to know about this. What they did was inexcusable, and you have every right to get your kindness back." And that's when Mrs. Watson told me something that changed everything I thought I knew about my neighborhood relationships. "Beverly, you know the Hendersons have been complaining about you for months, right? Saying you too pushy, too involved, that you make them uncomfortable with all your gifts and attention. They've been telling people you're lonely and desperate for friendship, and they only tolerate your kindness because they feel sorry for you." Sweetie, I felt all the air leave my lungs at once. My shoulders just dropped like I was carrying the world again. But this time, it wasn't just hurt. It was pure, white-hot anger. The words came out sharper than I meant them to when I said, "Is that what they've been telling people? Then I'm some pathetic old lady who can't take a hint?" Mrs. Watson nodded sadly, and honey, that's when something shifted inside me from righteous disappointment to absolute determination. You could hear the steel creeping into my voice when I told Mrs. Watson, well, they're about to learn exactly what this pathetic old lady is capable of when she stops being nice and starts being honest. The next morning, I got a phone call that made me sit down hard in my kitchen chair. It was Emma Henderson, the teenage daughter. And sweetie, she was crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. Mrs. Beverly, she sobbed, I'm so sorry about the Christmas presents. I didn't know Mom threw them away. I saw your makeup set and I was so excited because nobody ever buys me nice things like that. But Mom said we had to get rid of everything because Dad said you were getting too attached to you and it was weird. Y'all, I had to grip that phone so tight my hands started cramping because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This child had wanted my gift, had been excited about it, but her parents had thrown it away and told her it was weird for an old lady to be kind to neighbors. My voice broke right in half when I asked her, Emma, sweetie, did you know those presents were in the trash? No, ma'am, she whispered. I saw them when I was taking out my own trash bag, and I asked Mom why your presents were out there. She said Dad decided we needed to set boundaries with you because you were making our family uncomfortable. But Mrs. Beverly, you never made me uncomfortable. You always remember my birthday, and you always ask about my school plays, and you're the only adult in this whole neighborhood who knows my name. Honey, those tears were starting to sting my eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of hurt. They were tears of pure fury. The words came out between little sobs when I told Emma, Sweetie, you did nothing wrong. This is between me and your parents, and you don't need to worry about any of it. But Emma wasn't done talking. Miss Beverly, can I tell you something? My parents are really scared right now. Dad got your letter, and he's been on the phone with lawyers and accountants all day. Mom keeps saying they might have to move because you're going to sue them or report them to the government or something. They keep asking me if you ever gave them anything they should know about, like you're some kind of criminal or something. Y'all, a little smile crept in my voice when I heard that. You could hear the mischief just dancing in my tone because it sounded like my letter had been even more educational than I had hoped. Emma, honey, I'm not a criminal. I'm just a lady who kept very good records and decided to stop being taken advantage of. Your parents aren't in any real trouble. They're just learning that actions have consequences. After I hung up with Emma, I sat there in my kitchen thinking about everything I'd learned. The Hendersons hadn't just thrown away my gifts. They'd been actively bad-mouthing me to the entire neighborhood for months, painting me as some desperate old lady who couldn't take social hints. They'd taken my kindness, mocked it behind my back, and then literally thrown it in the trash while telling people I was pathetic. But you know what, sweetie? You could hear the satisfaction just bubbling up in my voice because I realized that my Christmas education program was working exactly as intended. These people were finally learning what it felt like to have their comfortable assumptions challenged, just like they challenged mine by throwing my love away. That afternoon, I got my second neighborhood response, and honey, this one was a doozy. Mr. Rodriguez showed up at my door with his hat in his hands and the most sheepish expression you ever saw. Mrs. Beverly, he said, his voice all awkward and apologetic, I got your letter about the packages, and I wanted to talk to you about everything. I invited him in for coffee, and y'all, what he told me next made my jaw drop to the floor. Apparently, the Hendersons had been spreading their poison further than I had realized. They've been telling people that I was obsessed with their family, that I stalked them with unwanted gifts, that I was probably suffering from dementia or loneliness-induced delusions. The thing is, Mrs. Beverly, he said, looking ashamed of himself, I started believing them. When you'd accept my packages, I started wondering if you were going through them. When you'd wave at my kids, I started wondering if it was inappropriate somehow. The Hendersons made everything you did sound creepy instead of kind. My voice was dripping with all that irony when I asked him, and now, Carlos, what do you think now that you're actually talking to me instead of listening to gossip? He looked me straight in the eye and said, now I think I owe you about 4 years worth of apologies and a very big thank you. And I think the Hendersons are about to learn what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. Carlos wasn't wrong about that, sweetie. Over the next week, I received responses from 9 of the 12 families I had written to. And honey, every single one of them had a story about how the Hendersons had been poisoning the well against me. Turns out they'd been conducting a systematic campaign to isolate me from the neighborhood, painting my kindness as mental illness and my generosity as inappropriate attachment. But you know what the most beautiful part was? Y'all could hear the joy just tumbling out of my voice when I realized that their plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of turning everyone against me, their gossip campaign had just made everyone realize how much I'd been doing for the neighborhood and how little credit I'd been getting for it. Mrs. Patterson from 2 streets over came by with a casserole and told me she'd been feeling guilty for months about accepting my help with her garden without ever offering to help with mine. The Johnson family around the corner brought me a gift card to thank me for all the dog sitting I'd done over the years. Even old Mr. Chin, who barely speaks English, showed up with a beautiful plant and a handwritten note in Chinese that his granddaughter translated as, "Thank you for seeing me as family." But the most surprising response came from someone I'd never written to at all. Y'all, I was out checking my mail on Thursday morning when a shiny black sedan pulled up in front of my house and outstepped the most professional-looking woman you ever saw. Tailored suit, briefcase, the works. She walked right up to me with her hand extended and said, "Mrs. Beverly, I'm Patricia Hamilton from Channel 12 News. I understand you have quite a story to tell about neighborhood kindness and Christmas spirit." Honey, my voice caught with pure amazement because I had no idea how the news had gotten involved. "I'm sorry, dear, but I think you might have the wrong person. I'm just an old lady dealing with some ungrateful neighbors." Patricia smiled this knowing smile and said, "Mrs. Beverly, we received an anonymous tip about a systematic harassment campaign against an elderly resident who had been providing thousands of dollars worth of free services to her neighborhood. The person who called us said it was the kind of story that needed to be told, especially during the Christmas season." Y'all, I found myself whispering like someone might overhear when I asked her, "Who would have called you about that?" We protect our sources, ma'am, but I can tell you that whoever called us had very detailed information about your situation, including documentation about gifts that were thrown away and neighbors who had been turned against you through false rumors. They seemed to think your story represented something important about how we treat elderly members of our communities. That's when it hit me, sweetie. Emma, that brave little girl, had seen what her parents were doing to me and decided to do something about it. The words just tumbled out faster than I could think when I realized that sometimes the most unexpected allies come from the most surprising places. Patricia spent 2 hours at my house that afternoon, going through my notebook, looking at the reclaimed Christmas presents, and taking notes about everything I documented over the years. My voice took on this excited quality as I told her the whole story because, honey, for the first time in months, I felt like someone was actually listening to my side of things. "Mrs. Beverly," she said as she was packing up her equipment, "would you be willing to go on camera with this story? I think a lot of people need to hear about what happens when kindness gets taken for granted." Y'all could hear the mischief dancing in my voice when I told her, "Honey, I've been waiting 72 years to have someone ask me that question." The interview was scheduled for the following Monday, which gave me the weekend to prepare. But sweetie, I didn't need to prepare because I'd been living this story every single day. What I needed to do was decide exactly how much truth I was ready to share with the entire Phoenix metropolitan area. Saturday morning, I was sitting on my back porch with my coffee, thinking about everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks, when I heard someone knocking on my front door. Not the doorbell, actual knocking, like someone was desperate to get my attention. I walked through the house and opened the door to find Mr. Henderson looking like he hadn't slept in days. "Mrs. Beverly," he said, his voice all strained and anxious, "we need to talk right now about everything that's been happening." I led him into my living room, but I didn't offer him coffee or a seat or any of the courtesies I used to extend automatically. Instead, I sat down in my favorite chair and looked at him with the kind of expression I used to give my kids when they'd been caught in a lie. "Go ahead, David. I'm listening." Y'all, what came out of that man's mouth next was the most pathetic attempt at damage control you ever heard. He started with excuses about how busy they'd been, how they meant to open the presents but hadn't gotten around to it, how the gifts had accidentally ended up in the trash during their holiday cleaning. My voice was pure ice when I interrupted him. "David, stop. Just stop lying to me. I talked to Emma. I know you threw my gifts away on purpose because you thought I was getting too attached. I know you've been telling the entire neighborhood that I'm mentally unstable and that my kindness is inappropriate. I know you've been painting me as some pathetic old lady who doesn't understand social boundaries." The silence stretched between us like a canyon. And honey, watching him squirm in that silence was more satisfying than any Christmas present I ever received. Finally, he said, "Mrs. Beverly, you have to understand our position. We never asked for all those gifts and favors. We felt obligated to accept them, but it was making us uncomfortable." My voice broke right in half with pure indignation when I asked him, "So instead of having an honest conversation with me about your feelings, you decided to mock me behind my back and throw my love away like garbage?" "It wasn't like that," he protested, but you could hear the weakness in his voice. We thought if we didn't respond to the Christmas gifts, you'd get the hint and back off." Honey, I couldn't help but let out this bitter little laugh because the audacity of this man was absolutely breathtaking. "David," I said, my voice dripping with all that irony, "let me make sure I understand this correctly. For 8 years, you accepted thousands of dollars worth of gifts, food, and services from me. You smiled to my face, thanked me for my thoughtfulness, and made me believe we had a friendly, neighborly relationship. But behind my back, you were telling people I was mentally ill and stalking your family. And then instead of having one honest conversation with me, you decided to throw my Christmas gifts in the trash and hope I'd get the hint. Do I have that right?" He couldn't even look me in the eye when he nodded. Y'all, a little smile crept into my voice because I realized that this conversation was about to become the most educational moment of David Henderson's entire adult life. You could hear the satisfaction just bubbling up when I leaned forward and said, "Well, David, I got your hint loud and clear, and now you're gonna get mine." I stood up and walked over to my bookshelf where I kept my notebook and a folder I'd been building for the past 2 weeks. This folder contains documentation of every gift, every favor, every kindness I've shown your family over 8 years. It contains photos of my Christmas gifts in your trash. It contains statements from neighbors about the rumors you've been spreading about my mental health. And on Monday morning, it's all going to be featured on Channel 12 News as part of a story about how elderly community members get treated by the people they try to help. The words came out sharper than I meant them to when I continued. "You wanted me to understand social boundaries, David? Well, honey, you're about to learn that the boundary between private shame and public accountability is a lot thinner than you thought." His face went white as a sheet, and sweetie, you should have seen how fast his tune changed. "Mrs. Beverly, please, you don't understand the position this puts us in. My wife's business, the kids' schools, our reputation in the community. A news story like this could ruin everything we've built here." My voice took on this knowing, satisfied quality when I looked him straight in the eye and said, "David, You should have thought about your reputation before you decided to mock the kindness of a 72-year-old woman who never did anything but try to be a good neighbor. But then something unexpected happened, y'all. This grown man, this 40-something professional who had been systematically undermining me for months, just broke down crying right there in my living room. Not pretty crying, mind you, ugly, desperate, shoulder-shaking sobs that made him sound like a child who'd finally been caught in the biggest lie of his life. "Mrs. Beverly," he choked out between sobs, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You're right about everything. We were ungrateful and cruel, and we treated you terribly. But please, I'm begging you, don't destroy our lives over this. My wife doesn't even know about the news story yet, and when she finds out, she's going to leave me. This will ruin my kids' lives at school. Please, there has to be something we can do to make this right." Y'all, I had to stop and catch my breath because I wasn't expecting this level of breakdown. For a hot minute there, I felt something that might have been pity trying to creep into my heart. But then I remembered those presents in the trash, remembered months of being mocked behind my back, remembered how they turned other neighbors against me with their lies. My voice was steady as a rock when I told him, "David, the time to make this right was 8 years ago when I brought you your first casserole. The time to make this right was 6 months ago when you decided I was getting too attached. The time to make this right was 2 weeks ago before you threw my Christmas gifts in the trash. But you know what? Even now, even after everything you've done, I'm still more interested in teaching lessons than destroying lives." I sat back down and looked at this broken man crying in my living room. And honey, I felt something shift inside me from pure anger to something that felt more like justice mixed with mercy. "Here's what's going to happen, David. You're going to go home and tell your wife about the news interview. You're going to sit your children down and explain to them what you did and why it was wrong. You're going to write a letter to every neighbor you gossip to, setting the record straight about my mental health and my motivations. And then on Monday morning, you're going to appear on camera with me to tell the whole story. Not just my side, but yours too." His head snapped up and he looked at me with pure panic. "Mrs. Beverly, I can't go on television. This will follow my family forever." You could hear the mischief dancing in my voice when I smiled at him and said, "David, honey, that's exactly the point. Actions have consequences, and consequences follow people. But here's the thing. If you do this right, if you own your mistakes publicly and show genuine remorse, this could be a story about redemption instead of just revenge. Your choice." And that's when I offered him something I don't think he was expecting. "Tell you what, David, you agreed to my terms, and after the news story airs, I'll publicly forgive your family. I'll make it clear that we resolved our differences and that I hold no grudges. I'll even continue being your neighbor, not your personal service provider, but your neighbor. But if you refuse, then Monday's story becomes about an unrepentant family who threw away an elderly woman's love and never even apologized." Y'all could hear the hope creeping into his voice when he asked me, "You would really do that? You'd forgive us publicly?" "David," I said, my voice soft but firm, "I'm 72 years old. I don't have time to hold grudges, and I don't have energy to waste on people who don't appreciate kindness. But I also don't have patience for people who think they can walk all over me without consequences. Show me genuine change, and I'll show you genuine forgiveness. It's that simple." He agreed to my terms right there in my living room, and honey, when he left my house that afternoon, he looked like a completely different man. Not just defeated, but maybe, just maybe, educated. Sunday was quiet, but Monday morning was anything but. The Channel 12 news van pulled up in front of my house at 8 a.m. sharp, and by 8:30, there was already a small crowd of neighbors gathering to see what was happening. Patricia Hamilton set up her equipment in my living room while I put on my best red sweater and my pearl necklace, the one Harold had given me for our 25th anniversary. David showed up right on time, looking like a man walking to his own execution, but he showed up. His wife Sarah came with him, and y'all, that woman looked like she'd been crying for 3 straight days. But you know what? They both sat down in front of that camera and told the truth. The interview lasted about 30 minutes, but sweetie, those were the most honest 30 minutes of conversation I'd had with the Henderson family in 8 years. David admitted to everything, the rumors, the gossip, the systematic campaign to isolate me from the neighborhood. Sarah talked about how they'd felt overwhelmed by my generosity, but had been too cowardly to address it directly. And I told my side of the story, from the trash pile discovery to my decision to reclaim everything I'd ever given to people who didn't appreciate it. But honey, the most powerful moment came when Patricia asked me directly, "Mrs. Beverly, what do you want people to learn from this story?" Y'all, I took a deep breath and looked straight into that camera, and the words came out with more clarity than I felt in months. I want people to understand that kindness isn't weakness and generosity isn't desperation. I want elderly folks to know that they don't have to accept disrespect just because they're older. And I want everyone to remember that the person you're taking for granted today might just be the person who decides tomorrow that they're done being taken for granted. When the camera stopped rolling, something beautiful happened. Sarah Henderson looked me in the eye with tears streaming down her face and said, "Mrs. Beverly, I know we don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that this experience has changed our family forever. My children are going to grow up understanding the real value of kindness because of what you've taught us." The news story aired that Tuesday evening when the 6 o'clock broadcast. And honey, my phone didn't stop ringing for 3 straight days. People from all over Phoenix would call in to share their own stories about being taken for granted by family and neighbors. An elderly man from Scottsdale called to tell me how his son had been stealing from him for years, and my story gave him the courage to finally report it. A grandmother from Tempe called to say that watching my interview helped her realize she didn't have to keep accepting disrespect from her daughter-in-law. But the call that meant the most came from a young woman named Jessica, who lived clear across town. "Mrs. Beverly," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I just wanted to thank you for showing me how I've been treating my own grandmother. I've been taking her kindness for granted for years, assuming she'd always be there to help me whenever I needed something. After watching your story, I drove straight to her house to apologize and to ask her what I could do to show her how much she means to me." Y'all, I could hear the satisfaction just bubbling up in my voice when I told Jessica, "Honey, that's exactly why I decided to share my story. Sometimes people need to see what happens when kindness runs out before they realize how precious it was in the first place." The ripple effects kept spreading throughout that week. Mrs. Watson organized a neighborhood potluck dinner in my honor, where everyone brought dishes and took turns sharing stories about times I'd helped them over the years. Mr. Rodriguez surprised me by showing up with his teenage sons, who spent an entire Saturday helping me with my yard work. Not because I asked, but because their father wanted them to understand the difference between taking help for granted and showing gratitude. Even old Mr. Chen, who I'd never had a full conversation with because of the language barrier, showed up at my door with his granddaughter to translate while he formally thanked me for years of small kindnesses I thought he'd never even noticed. Turns out he'd been telling his family for years about his angel neighbor who always made sure he felt included in the community. But the most surprising development came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the news story aired, I got a knock on my door from a woman I'd never seen before. She introduced herself as Margaret Thompson, and she was carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of professional smile that usually means someone wants something from you. "Mrs. Beverly," she said, "I'm the Director of Volunteer Services at Phoenix Community Outreach, and I've been following your story on the news. I have a proposition that I think might interest you. She explained that their organization had been struggling to connect elderly volunteers with families who truly appreciated their help. They'd been seeing too many situations like mine, generous older folks being taken advantage of by people who saw kindness as weakness rather than recognizing it as the gift it truly was. We'd like to offer you a position as our volunteer coordination specialist. Your job would be to help match generous volunteers with families and individuals who have demonstrated genuine need and genuine appreciation. You'd use your experience, both the good and the difficult parts, to help create relationships built on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. Honey, my voice caught with pure amazement because in all my 72 years, nobody had ever offered me a job that felt like it was designed specifically for who I was and what I learned. Margaret, I said, are you telling me that you want to pay me to help other people avoid going through what I just went through? She smiled and said, that's exactly what I'm telling you. And Mrs. Beverly, after seeing how you handled your situation with documentation, clear communication, and firm boundaries while still maintaining your capacity for forgiveness, I think you might be exactly what our program needs. Y'all, I accepted that job offer on the spot, and it turned out to be the best decision I'd made since moving to Phoenix 43 years ago. Within 2 months, I was helping coordinate volunteer matches all over the valley, using my little notebook system to help other generous folks keep track of their giving and teaching them how to recognize the difference between genuine need and convenient exploitation. But the real satisfaction came from the follow-up stories I started hearing. A widower in Mesa who'd been getting taken advantage of by his lazy nephew learned to set boundaries and found a community garden group that genuinely appreciated his expertise. A retired teacher in Glendale who'd been overwhelmed by demands from ungrateful former students discovered a literacy program where her help was valued and respected. An elderly veteran in Chandler who'd been doing free handyman work for people who never even said thank you found a Habitat for Humanity group that celebrated his skills and his service. And honey, every single one of these success stories started with someone learning the same lesson I learned that morning when I found my Christmas presents in the trash, that giving without boundaries isn't kindness, it's enabling. And that the most loving thing you can sometimes do for someone is to let them experience the natural consequences of taking your generosity for granted. The Henderson family kept their word about the public apology and the neighbor conversations. David wrote heartfelt letters to everyone he gossiped to, and Sarah started volunteering with a local charity that helps isolated elderly residents. Not because I asked her to, but because she said she wanted to understand what real service looked like. Her kids, Emma and Tyler, became some of the most polite teenagers you'd ever want to meet, always waving and saying hello whenever they saw me in the yard. But the most beautiful part of the whole resolution came 6 months later when Emma graduated from high school. Y'all, that young woman knocked on my door 2 days before her graduation ceremony, holding an envelope with my name written on it in her careful handwriting. Mrs. Beverly, she said, her voice full of nervous excitement, I wanted to give this to you before the ceremony. It's my graduation speech, and I wanted you to read it first because part of it's about you. I invited her in for tea and cookies, and honey, when I read that speech, I had to set it down twice because my eyes were getting too blurry with happy tears to see the words clearly. Emma had written about learning the difference between taking kindness for granted and recognizing it as a gift. She'd written about how watching her family's mistakes and my response had taught her more about integrity and forgiveness than any lecture or lesson ever could have. But the part that made me cry the happiest tears was when she wrote about her plans for college. I decided to major in social work because I want to spend my life connecting people who have loved to give with people who need it and will value it. I want to help build communities where kindness is recognized and respected, where giving and receiving happen in balance, and where people like Mrs. Beverly never have to find their love thrown away like garbage. Y'all, my voice was pure excitement when I told that brilliant girl, Emma, honey, you just described the most important career in the world. And after everything your family and I have been through together, I think you understand better than most people what that work really requires. She hugged me goodbye that afternoon, and as I watched her walk back to her house, I realized that sometimes the most beautiful gifts come in the most difficult packages. If the Hendersons had never thrown my Christmas presents away, I never would have discovered my calling as a volunteer coordinator. If they'd never spread rumors about me, I never would have learned how many neighbors genuinely appreciated my kindness. If they'd never broken my heart, I never would have found the strength to demand the respect I deserved.
The story that started with me standing in my bathrobe at 6 in the morning, heartbroken and humiliated, had somehow transformed into a new chapter of my life that was more meaningful and more satisfying than anything I'd experienced since Harold died. I was helping people all over Phoenix build healthier relationships. I was earning a paycheck for the first time in decades. And most importantly, I was using everything I'd learned about kindness and boundaries to help other people avoid the pain I'd gone through. But honey, the real victory wasn't in the job or the recognition or even in the Henderson family's public apology. The real victory was in what I discovered about myself during those difficult weeks. I learned that at 72 years old, I was still strong enough to stand up for myself. I learned that kindness without boundaries isn't kindness at all. It's self-sacrifice that helps nobody. And I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach people what happens when they take love for granted. 6 months after that morning by my kitchen window, I was back at that same window having my morning coffee, but everything had changed. Instead of watching garbage trucks and feeling invisible, I was planning my day at a job that mattered, surrounded by neighbors who knew my worth, living in a community where respect went both ways. And you know what the most beautiful part was? Y'all, every single morning when I looked out that window, I saw the Henderson family loading their own trash into their own bins, taking care of their own responsibilities, living their lives with a little more awareness of how their actions affected other people. They learned to be self-sufficient instead of expecting free services. They learned to be grateful instead of entitled. And they'd learn that relationships work best when both sides contribute. That Christmas, exactly 1 year after the trash pile incident, I got a card from the Henderson family. Not expensive gifts that would have made everyone uncomfortable, but a simple, heartfelt card with a message that said, "Mrs. Beverly, thank you for teaching our family the difference between taking kindness for granted and treasuring it as the gift it truly is. We hope your holidays are filled with the same joy and love you've brought to so many people's lives." I kept that card on my refrigerator all year long, not because it erased what they'd done, but because it represented something even more valuable: genuine change, genuine growth, and genuine appreciation earned through genuine consequences. And every time I looked at it, I remembered that sometimes the most important gifts don't come wrapped in pretty paper and tied with bows. Sometimes they come disguised as problems that force you to discover strength you didn't know you had, wisdom you didn't know you'd gained, and value you'd forgotten you possessed. Y'all, if I learned anything from finding my Christmas presents in that trash pile, is that the person who decides your worth should always be you. The people who can't see your value don't deserve your gifts. And the most beautiful thing you can give yourself is the knowledge that you're strong enough to take back your love when it's not being treasured the way it should be. Honey, I'm 73 now, and I wake up every morning grateful for that terrible December day when I saw my kindness thrown away like garbage. Because that was the day I finally learned the difference between being generous and being a doormat. That was the day I discovered that demanding respect isn't mean, it's necessary. And that was the day I realized that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is show people what life looks like when they can't take your kindness for granted anymore. So if you're listening to this story and you recognize yourself as someone who gives and gives without getting appreciation back, remember what Mama Beverly learned that cold December morning in Phoenix. Your kindness has value. Your generosity deserves respect, and you have every right to take back your gifts from people who treat them like trash. Sometimes the most beautiful Christmas present you can give yourself is the knowledge that you're worth so much more than how you're being treated. And if you're listening to this story and you recognize yourself as someone who's been taking kindness for granted, well, honey, consider this your gentle reminder that the generous people in your life won't wait around forever for you to appreciate them. Show them their worth before they decide to show you what life looks like without their love. Because at the end of the day, y'all, kindness is a gift, respect is a choice, and boundaries are a necessity. The people who understand that will be blessed with love that lasts a lifetime. The people who don't will learn the hard way that even the most generous hearts have limits, and even the most forgiving souls eventually run out of patience for being taken for granted. Merry Christmas, sweethearts, and remember, your love is precious, your kindness matters, and you deserve to be treasured by the people you choose to treasure. Don't ever let anybody convince you otherwise.